The distant whistle of the locomotive pierced the evening air as Margaret Harlow pressed her bruised cheek against the cool glass window, watching the untamed landscape of Montana Territory blur past at 40 miles an hour. It was 1884, and she had never felt more alone, more desperate, or more determined to escape. The purple and yellow marks blooming across her skin told a story she'd never share willingly. Her father's ring had split her lip 3 days ago when she'd refused the marriage he'd arranged to a man 30 years her senior. Her brother's tight grip had left finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms when he dragged her onto the train, bound for her new life in Billings where her soon-to-be husband awaited. They were asleep now. Her father slumped against the opposite window, her brother sprawled across 2 seats, both lulled by the whiskey they'd consumed after dinner in the dining car. This was her only chance. Margaret glanced at her reflection in the glass, her once vibrant green eyes now dulled with fear, her chestnut hair hastily pinned back, her face a canvas of fading yellows and fresh purples. She was 20 years old, and this train was carrying her toward a life of continued abuse, only at different hands. She carefully reached for her small valise, tucking inside the few possessions she treasured: her mother's silver hairbrush, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights, and the meager savings she'd managed to hide in its hollowed-out middle. With shaking hands, she fastened the clasp and rose from her seat. The train was slowing as it approached a bend in the tracks, the wheels screeching slightly against the rails. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as she crept down the aisle, past sleeping passengers, toward the rear of the car where a small platform connected to the next carriage. Cold air hit her face as she stepped out, closing the door quietly behind her. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles as she gripped the metal railing and looked out at the darkness. Rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional pine spread out before her. In the distance, she could make out what appeared to be a small campfire. Freedom was one leap away. Yet fear froze her in place. The train was still moving too fast. She could die from the fall or be left stranded in the wilderness. But the alternative, the life awaiting her, seemed a slower death of the spirit. Margaret took a deep breath, clutched her valise to her chest, and stepped up onto the bottom rail. The ground rushed below her, rocky and unforgiving. She closed her eyes. Now or never, she whispered to herself. She jumped. The world spun violently as she tumbled through the air. Her skirts billowed around her, offering no protection as she crashed toward the hard ground. Margaret braced for the impact that would surely break her bones or worse. Instead, she collided with something solid yet yielding. Not earth, but flesh and muscle. A grunt of surprise and pain erupted beneath her as she and her unexpected cushion rolled together down a short embankment. When they finally stopped, Margaret found herself staring up at the star-filled Montana sky, the breath knocked completely from her lungs. She turned her head slightly to see what or who had broken her fall. A man lay beside her, hat knocked aside, rubbing his shoulder with a grimace. In the faint moonlight, she could make out the silhouette of a strong jaw covered with stubble, broad shoulders, and the unmistakable shape of a cowboy's attire. "Madam," he said in a deep voice tinged with both pain and bewilderment, "I can't say I've ever had a woman fall from the sky before." He sat up slowly, reaching for his hat. "Most prefer to arrive by more conventional methods." Margaret tried to speak, but could only cough as her lungs struggled to refill with air. The man moved toward her with concern, helping her to sit up with a gentle hand on her back. "Easy now," he said. "That was quite a fall. Are you hurt?" As she caught her breath, Margaret became acutely aware of the throbbing pain in her ankle and the fresh scrapes on her hands, but these new injuries paled in comparison to what she was fleeing. "I'm fine," she managed to say, though her voice quavered. "Thank you for catching me." The man studied her face in the dim light, and she knew the moment he noticed the bruises. His expression shifted from confusion to something harder, more serious. "Somebody did that to you?" It wasn't a question. Margaret turned away, reaching for her valise which had sprung open during the fall. "It doesn't matter now." He rose to his feet and offered her his hand. "Name's Vincent Keller. Most folks call me Vince." She hesitated before placing her hand in his. "Margaret Harlow." Well, Miss Harlow, I reckon anybody jumping from a moving train has a mighty good reason. He helped her stand, steadying her when she winced and favored her injured ankle. My camp's just over that rise. Let's get you somewhere safe, tend to that ankle, and then you can decide what comes next. Margaret glanced back at the train, now just a distant set of lights disappearing around a bend. Everything she had known, both good and terrible, was on that train, moving away from her at 40 miles an hour. I don't have anywhere to go, she admitted, the reality of her situation finally hitting her. Vincent picked up her valise, gathering the few items that had spilled out. Tonight you've got somewhere. Tomorrow's worries can wait till morning light. He whistled softly, and from the darkness emerged a magnificent chestnut quarter horse. Vincent secured her valise to the saddle before turning back to Margaret. May I? He asked, gesturing to help her. She nodded, and he carefully lifted her onto the horse before mounting behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and Margaret felt an unfamiliar sense of security in the embrace of this stranger. His body was warm against the chill of the night, and he smelled of leather, sage, and wood smoke. Thank you, she whispered again, unsure if he could hear her. But his gentle response proved he had. No need for thanks, Miss Harlow. Out here we look after those who need looking after. As they rode toward the campfire's glow, Margaret felt the weight of her old life beginning to lift. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Vincent's campsite was simple but well established. A small tent was pitched near a stand of cottonwoods, and a neat fire burned in a ring of stones. Near the fire, a coffee pot sat on a flat rock and a bedroll was laid out. "This is home?" Margaret asked as Vincent helped her down from the horse. "For now," he replied. "I move with the seasons and the work." He guided her to sit on a fallen log near the fire, then went to tend to his horse. Margaret watched him remove the saddle and brush the animal down with practiced movements. The firelight played across his features, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way. He was older than she, perhaps 30, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and caution. When he returned to the fire, he carried a saddlebag and canteen. "Let's have a look at that ankle." Margaret instinctively pulled back, years of defensive habits hard to break. Vincent recognized her fear immediately and stepped back, raising his hands slightly. "I won't touch you without permission, Miss Harlow, but that ankle needs tending or you'll not be walking tomorrow." His respect for her boundaries helped ease her tension. "I'm sorry, you're right." He knelt before her, maintaining a respectful distance. "May I?" She nodded, extending her injured foot slightly with careful movements. Vincent removed her boot and lifted her skirt just enough to examine her ankle, which had already begun to swell. His touch was gentle, clinical, and he worked quickly. "Not broken, I don't think, but a bad sprain." He retrieved a cloth from his saddlebag, soaked it in cold water from the canteen, and wrapped it around her ankle. "This will help with the swelling." "You seem to know what you're doing," Margaret observed. "When you work cattle, you learn to mend all manner of injuries." He poured a cup of coffee from the pot and offered it to her. "It's strong, but it'll warm you." The coffee was indeed strong, bitter even, but the warmth spread through her body, helping to calm her shaking hands. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving to the other side of the fire. The mention of food made Margaret realize she hadn't eaten since a meager lunch on the train. "Yes, thank you." Vincent produced a tin of beans and a small loaf of bread from his supplies. As he prepared the simple meal, Margaret found herself studying him, trying to understand why this stranger would help her so readily. "Why were you near the tracks?" she asked suddenly. He didn't look up from his task. "I was camping here because it's good grazing for my horse. Heard the train coming and saw someone fall." He shrugged. "Instinct took over." "Lucky for me," Margaret said softly. Vincent handed her a plate of beans and bread. "Luck, fate, providence, whatever brought you here, I'm glad I was there to catch you." They ate in silence for a time, the crackling of the fire and distant sounds of night creatures the only accompaniment to their meal. Margaret's mind raced with questions about what she should do next, where she could go, how she would survive. "What's your story, Miss Harlow?" Vincent finally asked, setting aside his empty plate. If you don't mind my asking. Margaret touched her bruised cheek self-consciously. My father arranged a marriage for me to a man I've never met, a man who. She hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. A man who's known for being cruel to his previous wives, and those bruises, my father's way of ensuring my compliance. She looked down at her hands. My mother died 3 years ago. Since then, he's changed, or perhaps he was always this way, and my mother protected me from the worst of it. Vincent's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. And now you're running. Yes, she looked up at him defiantly. I won't go back. I wouldn't expect you to. He tossed a small branch into the fire. What's your plan? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Margaret had no plan beyond escape. She had some money, but not enough to start a new life. She had no family to turn to, no friends who weren't connected to her father. I don't know, she admitted. I need to find work somewhere far from here where they won't look for me. Vincent nodded thoughtfully. Well, there's a town about 2 days' ride from here, Pine Ridge. It's small but growing, might be a place to start fresh. What kind of work could I find there, for a woman? Vincent considered. The hotel might need help. There's a new schoolhouse that needs a teacher, though I don't know if you've got those skills. The general store owner's wife just had a baby. She might welcome an extra pair of hands. Hope flickered within Margaret. These were real possibilities, tangible starts to a new life. Could you? Would you show me the way to Pine Ridge? Vincent studied her for a long moment. I can do better than that. I'm heading there myself to deliver some horses. I can take you along, help you get situated. Relief washed over Margaret like a cool breeze. I can pay you for your trouble. He waved away her offer. Keep your money, you'll need it more than I will. Margaret was overwhelmed by his kindness, so at odds with the treatment she'd received from the men in her life. Thank you, Mr. Keller. I don't know how to repay such generosity. Vince, he corrected, and there's no debt here, just one person helping another. He rose and moved to his tent. You take the tent tonight, I'll sleep by the fire. I couldn't take your shelter, Margaret protested. You can and you will, he said firmly, but with a hint of a smile. I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. Too exhausted to argue further, Margaret accepted his offer with grateful thanks. Inside the small canvas tent, she found a clean bedroll laid out on a ground sheet. The simple accommodation felt like luxury after her ordeal. As she settled in for the night, she could see Vincent's silhouette through the tent flap, sitting by the fire, keeping watch. The train was miles away now, carrying with it the life she'd left behind. Tomorrow would bring a new journey, new challenges, and perhaps, finally, a chance at freedom. For the first time in years, Margaret Harlow fell asleep without fear. The morning sun filtered through the canvas, warming Margaret's face and gently pulling her from sleep. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was, not in her bedroom at home, not on the train. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, along with the aches in her body from her desperate leap. She sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her ankle. The swelling had gone down somewhat, but it still throbbed when she moved. Outside, she could hear movement, the soft nickering of a horse, the clatter of cookware, the sound of wood being added to a fire. Margaret took a moment to assess her situation. Her dress was dirty and torn in places from the fall. She had no change of clothes except for a spare blouse in her valise. Her hair had come completely loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. She did her best to smooth it back and repin it with the few hairpins she could find. When she emerged from the tent, she found Vincent already up and preparing breakfast. A second horse, a dappled gray mare, was tethered near his chestnut stallion. Morning, he greeted her, glancing up from the fire where bacon sizzled in a small pan. Sleep well. Better than I expected, she replied honestly. Is that another horse? Vincent nodded. Misty? She's one of the horses I'm delivering to Pine Ridge, gentlest mare you'll ever meet. Figured she'd be better for you to ride, considering your ankle. You've thought of everything, Margaret said, touched by his consideration, habit from trail life. Planning ahead keeps you alive. He gestured to a small basin of water he'd set up on a flat stone. I brought water from the creek if you want to freshen up. Breakfast will be ready soon. Margaret gratefully accepted the chance to wash her face and hands. The cool water was reviving, and she felt more human after removing the dust of travel from her skin. When she returned to the fire, Vincent handed her a tin plate with bacon and a thick slice of cornbread. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but it'll keep you going." "It's perfect," she assured him, taking a bite of the cornbread. It was dense and slightly sweet, clearly homemade. Before he'd set out on his journey, as they ate, Vincent outlined his plan. "We'll ride until midday, then rest during the hottest part of the day. Make camp at sundown. If we keep a steady pace, we should reach Pine Ridge by tomorrow evening." "My ankle won't slow us down," Margaret asked. "Misty will do the work. You just need to stay on her back." He finished his breakfast and began cleaning up. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Margaret nodded. "My mother insisted I learn, said a proper lady should be able to ride side saddle for social occasions." Vincent gave a soft laugh. "Well, out here, practical beats proper. You'll be riding astride safer for the terrain we'll be crossing. Your skirts will manage." Margaret blushed slightly but nodded her agreement. Propriety seemed a small concern compared to safety. They broke camp efficiently, with Vincent taking down the tent and packing it onto his horse while Margaret gathered what few belongings she had. He showed her how to mount Misty despite her injured ankle, and once she was settled in the saddle, he handed her the reins. "She'll follow my lead mostly, but it's good for you to feel in control," he explained. Margaret adjusted her skirts as best she could over her legs and straightened her back. Despite everything, there was a thrill in setting out into the unknown, away from the prison her life had become. They rode at a steady pace through rolling hills, covered with prairie grass that rippled like golden waves in the morning breeze. Vincent pointed out landmarks and wildlife as they traveled, a hawk circling overhead, the distant silhouette of deer at the edge of a stand of trees, the subtle signs of a creek that would provide water for their midday rest. Margaret found herself studying her companion as they rode. Vincent sat easily in the saddle, his body moving in natural rhythm with his horse. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert to any change or potential danger. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and direct. "How did you become a cowboy?" she asked as they rode side by side along a flat stretch of land. Vincent considered the question. "Wasn't much choice for a boy with no family and no prospects. Started working cattle when I was 14, learned from the older hands, been doing it ever since. No family at all." Margaret couldn't imagine being so completely alone in the world. "Lost my ma to fever when I was 10. Pa took to drinking after that, got himself killed in a barroom fight 2 years later." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "Orphanage wasn't for me, so I ran. Found work at her ranch, proved myself useful enough to keep." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. Vincent shrugged. "It shaped me, but it doesn't define me. We all carry our pasts, Miss Harlow." "Margaret," she corrected him. "Please call me Margaret." He nodded, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "Margaret, then." The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat intensifying. By midday, as Vincent had promised, they stopped near a small creek shaded by cottonwood trees. He helped Margaret dismount, his strong hands gentle at her waist. "How's the ankle?" he asked as she tested her weight on it. "Better, I think. Still sore, but I can put some weight on it now." Vincent nodded, satisfied. "Good, rest it while I see to the horses." Margaret sat on a sun-warmed rock by the creek, removing her boot to bathe her ankle in the cool water. She watched as Vincent unsaddled the horses, led them to drink, and then tethered them where they could graze on the lush grass. He returned with some dried beef, cheese, and a handful of dried berries. "Not as good as breakfast, but it'll tide us over." They ate in companionable silence, listening to the gentle sounds of the creek and the occasional snort from the horses. The quietness of the moment was soothing after the tumult of the past days. "Tell me about Pine Ridge," Margaret said eventually. "What kind of place is it?" Vincent leaned back against a tree trunk. "It started as just a trading post about 15 years ago. Grew into a proper town when silver was discovered in the hills nearby. The boom's over now, but the town survived. About 500 people, give or take. Has most of what you'd need: general store, hotel, saloon, church, doctor. And the people, decent folk mostly, hard-working." Mind their own business which might suit your situation. He gave her a knowing look. The town's growing, new families arriving, building homes. There's opportunity there. Margaret tried to picture herself in this frontier town, making a new life among strangers. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "What about you?" she asked. "Is Pine Ridge your home?" Vincent shook his head. "Don't really have a permanent home. I work for different ranchers, moving herds, breaking horses, whatever needs doing. Winter at one place, summer at another." "Doesn't that get lonely?" The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. If Vincent was offended, he didn't show it. "Sometimes, but there's a kind of freedom in it too, no one to answer to but myself." He met her gaze directly. "Though I reckon you understand something about wanting freedom." Margaret looked down at her hands. "Yes, I never thought I'd find myself here running away, starting over with nothing, but the alternative—" She trailed off, unable to voice the dark future that had awaited her. "Courage takes many forms," Vincent said quietly. "Sometimes it's standing your ground, sometimes it's knowing when to leave." His words settled over her like a bomb, easing the doubt that had begun to creep in. This man, this stranger who had literally caught her when she fell, seemed to understand her in a way no one ever had. After their rest, they continued their journey. The landscape began to change, with more trees dotting the hills and the terrain becoming slightly more rugged. Vincent led them along game trails and shallow creek beds, avoiding the main roads where Margaret might be recognized if her father and brother came searching for her. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and the air had taken on the heavy stillness that precedes a storm. Vincent glanced at the sky with concern. "We need to find shelter before that hits," he said, urging his horse to a slightly quicker pace. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead that the ranch hands use during roundup. Not much, but it's solid." They reached the shack just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. It was a simple one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs, with a small porch and a lean-to for horses. Inside was Spartan, a small iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame with a straw mattress, and shelves stocked with basic supplies. Vincent quickly settled the horses in the lean-to while Margaret took stock of the cabin. Despite its simplicity, it was clean and dry. She found a broom and swept the floor while Vincent brought in their gear and started a fire in the stove. Outside, the storm broke in earnest. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, the small cabin grew warm and surprisingly cozy as Vincent prepared a simple stew from supplies he found on the shelves, supplemented with ingredients from his own provisions. "The ranch owner keeps these shacks stocked," he explained as he worked. "Unwritten rule of the territory: you use what you need, replace what you can, and leave the place better than you found it." Margaret set the small table with tin plates and cups she found on a shelf. "It's a good system, people looking out for each other. Out here, it's necessary." Vincent stirred the stew, which had begun to fill the cabin with a savory aroma. "The land doesn't forgive those who come unprepared, and it doesn't care about your troubles. But people, good people, they can make the difference between survival and perishing." The meal was simple but satisfying, and as they ate, the storm continued to rage outside. The sound of rain on the roof created a cocoon of isolation that made their conversation flow more easily than it had before. Margaret told Vincent more about her life, her childhood on the family farm in Missouri, the death of her mother from pneumonia, her father's descent into bitterness and violence, her brother's choice to follow in his footsteps. She spoke of dreams deferred, of wanting to become a teacher, of the books she'd secretly read, of her hope for a life where she might have some say in her own destiny. Vincent listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. In turn, he shared stories of his years on the range, cattle drives through dangerous territory, encounters with all manner of people from saints to outlaws, the beauty and harshness of the land he'd come to love. "I've never spoken so freely with anyone," Margaret admitted as they finished the coffee Vincent had brewed. "Certainly not with a man." "Sometimes it's easier to open up to a stranger," Vincent said. "No history, no expectations." He paused, then added softly, though I hope I'm becoming more than a stranger to you." The warmth in his voice made Margaret look up to meet his gaze. In the soft light from the lantern, his eyes held a gentleness that contrasted with his weathered exterior. For the first time, she truly saw him not just as her rescuer, but as a man, one whose kindness and quiet strength stirred something within her that she'd never felt before. "You are," she said simply. "You're becoming a friend." A smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I'm glad." The storm showed no signs of abating as night fell completely. The question of sleeping arrangements hung unspoken between them until Vincent finally addressed it. "You take the bed," he said, rising to clear their dishes. "I'll make a pallet by the stove." "You've given up your tent and now your bed," Margaret protested. "I can't keep taking your comforts." "It's no hardship," he assured her. "I've slept in worse places than a warm cabin floor." Margaret knew it would be improper to suggest any alternative, despite the innocence of their situation. The small cabin offered no privacy, and though she trusted Vincent implicitly after their short acquaintance, the habits of propriety were deeply ingrained. While Vincent stepped outside briefly to check on the horses, Margaret took the opportunity to prepare for sleep as best she could. She loosened her hair and used her mother's silver brush to work through the tangles. The familiar ritual was comforting, a small piece of normalcy in a world turned upside down. When Vincent returned, dripping from the rain despite his quick dash to and from the lean-to, he found Margaret seated on the edge of the bed, her chestnut hair falling in waves down her back. He stopped in the doorway, clearly struck by the sight. "I'm sorry," she said, quickly gathering her hair over one shoulder. "I should have waited until you were settled." "No need to apologize," he said, removing his wet coat and hanging it by the door. "It's your right to be comfortable." As he arranged blankets on the floor near the stove, Margaret noticed how he kept his back turned, giving her as much privacy as the small space allowed. She slipped under the blanket on the narrow bed, still fully clothed except for her boots. "Good night, Vincent," she said softly. "Good night, Margaret," he replied, his deep voice a comforting rumble in the darkness as he extinguished the lantern. The storm continued through the night, but Margaret slept more soundly than she had in years, lulled by the rain and the quiet presence of the man who had, in the span of a day, become her protector, guide, and friend. Morning arrived with clearing skies and a freshness in the air that only comes after a good rain. Margaret awoke to find Vincent already up, stoking the fire in the stove and setting water to boil for coffee. She sat up, quickly smoothing her hair back and pinning it into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. "You should have woken me," she said, embarrassed to have slept so late. "You needed the rest," Vincent replied, not turning around until she had finished arranging her hair. "How's the ankle this morning?" Margaret rotated her foot experimentally. "Much better. I think I can ride without trouble today." "Good. If the trails aren't too muddy, we should reach Pine Ridge by sundown." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. "There's some oats for porridge." Not exciting, but filling. They ate quickly and efficiently, both aware that the day's journey would be challenging after the storm. Vincent insisted on washing the dishes and returning the cabin to order while Margaret gathered her few belongings. "Thank you for this," she said as they prepared to leave. "For everything." Vincent paused in his task of saddling the horses. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Margaret." "Yes, I do," she insisted quietly. "You've shown me more kindness in 2 days than most have shown me in years." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Then perhaps you've known the wrong people." The day's ride was indeed challenging. The storm had left the ground soft and treacherous in places, forcing them to proceed more cautiously than Vincent had planned. They followed ridgelines where possible, avoiding the marshy lowlands where horses could easily lose footing. Despite the difficulties, Margaret found herself enjoying the journey. The rain had brought out vibrant colors in the landscape: the bright green of new grass, the rich brown of wet earth, the clear blue of the sky now cleared of clouds. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, adding splashes of purple, yellow, and white to the scene. As they rode, Vincent pointed out tracks in the mud deer, rabbit, coyote, and explained how to read the land. Margaret absorbed his lessons eagerly, finding in his knowledge a different kind of education than she'd ever received. By mid-afternoon, they crested a hill and Vincent reined in his horse. "There," he said, pointing to the valley below. "Pine Ridge." Margaret felt her breath catch. From their vantage point, they could see the entire town, a collection of wooden buildings along a main street, with houses and smaller structures spreading outward. A church steeple rose above the other rooftops, and thin columns of smoke marked where stoves and fireplaces were in use. It wasn't large, but it looked well established and welcoming. "It's lovely," Margaret said softly. "It's a good town," Vincent agreed. "Ready?" She nodded, suddenly nervous about what awaited her. This would be her new beginning, her chance to create a life of her own choosing. As they descended toward Pine Ridge, Vincent suggested they stop at the livery stable first. "The owner, Sam Wilson, is a friend. He's expecting these horses, and he might know of work or lodging for you." The livery stable was at the edge of town, a large wooden structure with a corral attached. As they approached, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard emerged from the wide doors. "Vince Keller, right on time despite the storm," the man called out cheerfully. His smile faltered slightly when he noticed Margaret. "And you've brought company." "Sam, this is Miss Margaret Harlow," Vincent introduced her as they dismounted. "She's looking for work and a fresh start in Pine Ridge." Sam Wilson wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt before offering one to Margaret. "Pleasure, Miss Harlow. Any friend of Vince's is welcome here." Margaret shook his hand, appreciating his straightforward manner. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." "Sam, please. We're not formal in Pine Ridge." He turned to inspect the gray mare. "She's a beauty, Vince. Just like you described, the doc will be pleased." As Sam led the horses into the stable, Vincent explained to Margaret, "I broke these horses for Sam's brother's ranch. The mare's going to the town doctor. He needs a reliable mount for house calls." Inside the stable, they settled the business of the horses quickly. Sam paid Vincent for his work, and the conversation naturally turned to Margaret's situation. "Miss Harlow needs work and a place to stay," Vincent said. "I thought you might know what's available in town." Sam rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well now, as it happens, Martha over at the hotel was just saying she needs help. Her girl got married last month and moved to her husband's farm. And there's a room above the general store that Mrs. Bradley rents out." Hope surged in Margaret's chest. "I'm willing to work hard at whatever is available." "I don't doubt it," Sam said with a kind smile. "Tell you what, let me finish up with these horses and I'll walk you both over to the hotel. Martha's a fair employer and she's got a good heart." While Sam completed the necessary paperwork for the horses, Vincent drew Margaret aside. "This is a good start," he said quietly. "Martha Evans runs a respectable establishment. You'll be safe there. Will you stay in Pine Ridge for a while?" Margaret asked, surprised by how important his answer suddenly seemed to her. Vincent hesitated. "I've got work lined up at the Circle D Ranch, about 10 miles from here." "I'm due there tomorrow." "Oh," Margaret couldn't hide her disappointment. "But I come into town fairly often," he added quickly. "And I'll make sure you're settled before I go." Sam rejoined them, and the three walked together into the center of Pine Ridge. The main street was bustling with late afternoon activity shoppers at the general store, men entering and leaving the saloon, a wagon being loaded with supplies. People nodded greetings to Sam as they passed, and he returned each with a friendly word. The Pine Ridge Hotel stood 3 stories tall in the middle of town, its freshly painted sign proclaiming clean rooms and good food. Sam led them through the front door into a tidy lobby with polished wood floors and comfortable-looking chairs. "Martha," Sam called, "got some folks here to see you." A plump woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sam Wilson, there's no need to shout in my lobby," she scolded, though her eyes were kind. "Sorry, Martha, this here's Vince Keller does horsework for my brother. And this young lady is Miss Margaret Harlow. She's looking for employment and a place to stay. Thought of you right away." Martha's keen eyes took in Margaret's appearance, the travel-worn dress, the fading bruises she couldn't completely hide, the determined set of her shoulders despite her evident fatigue. "You ever worked in a hotel before, Miss Harlow?" Martha asked directly. "No, madam," Margaret answered honestly, "but I'm a quick learner and not afraid of hard work. I can cook, clean, and I've some education reading, writing, figures." Martha nodded approvingly. "Education's always useful. What brings you to Pine Ridge?" Margaret glanced at Vincent, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I'm starting fresh. My situation back home became untenable." Understanding dawned in Martha's eyes as she noticed the fading bruises. "Say no more, child. We all have stories, and some chapters are better left behind us." She straightened her apron decisively. "I need help with the rooms, serving meals, and general upkeep. Pay is fair room and board plus $8 a week. You'll have Sundays free unless we're unusually busy." "That's very generous, Mrs. Evans," Margaret said, almost lightheaded with relief. "Martha, please, and it's not generosity, it's business. Good help is hard to find out here." She turned to Sam and Vincent. "Thank you both for bringing her by. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to show Miss Harlow to her room and explain her duties." Vincent stepped forward. "I'd like to make sure Miss Harlow is properly settled, if that's all right." Martha raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Fine, Sam, we'll see you at supper. Wouldn't miss your beef stew for anything, Martha," Sam replied with a grin before taking his leave. Martha led them up a narrow staircase to the second floor. "Staff quarters are in the back," she explained, walking down a hallway lined with doors. "Small but private." The room she showed them was indeed small but meticulously clean, with a single bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a chair by the window that overlooked the street. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and fresh flowers stood in a small vase on the windowsill. "It's perfect," Margaret breathed, hardly able to believe her good fortune. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall shared with my other girl, Betty, who works in the kitchen. Meals are in the dining room with the guests, but at separate tables. Work starts at 6, ends when the evening chores are done, usually around 8. Martha handed Margaret a key. "I'll leave you to get settled. Come down when you're ready and we'll discuss specifics." When Martha had gone, Margaret turned to Vincent, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. "I can't believe this is happening." "You deserve this chance," he said quietly. "A fresh start on your own terms. I wouldn't be here without you." She stepped closer to him, suddenly aware of how much this man had come to mean to her in such a short time. "How can I ever repay you?" Vincent shook his head. "There's nothing to repay, just—" He hesitated, then continued softly, "Just be happy, Margaret. That's all the payment I need." Something in his voice, in the way his eyes held hers, made Margaret's heart beat faster. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "I'll try." For a moment they stood in silence, the connection between them almost palpable in the quiet room. Then Vincent gently covered her hand with his own. "I should go. Let you get settled." "Will I see you before you leave for the ranch?" Margaret couldn't bear the thought that this might be goodbye. "I'll be staying at the hotel tonight. We can talk at dinner." He released her hand reluctantly. "Rest now. You've had quite a journey." After Vincent left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the swiftness with which her life had changed. 3 days ago, she had been trapped in a nightmare, being carried toward a future she dreaded. Now she was in a clean room of her own, with honest work and the beginnings of a new life. And then there was Vincent. A man unlike any she had ever known, kind, honorable, gentle despite his rough exterior. A man who had literally caught her when she fell, and who continued to steady her as she found her footing in this new world. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to hope not just for survival, but for happiness. The hotel dining room buzzed with conversation as travelers and townsfolk gathered for the evening meal. Margaret, now dressed in a clean blouse she'd had in her valise, and with her hair neatly arranged, stood nervously by the kitchen door. Martha had given her a quick overview of her duties, and tomorrow she would begin in earnest, but tonight she was to simply observe and get acquainted with the rhythm of the hotel. She spotted Vincent at a corner table, deep in conversation with Sam Wilson and another man she didn't recognize. He looked up as if sensing her presence and immediately rose from his chair. Something in the way his face brightened when he saw her made Margaret's heart flutter. Miss Harlow, he greeted her, gesturing to an empty chair at their table. Please join us. Thank you, she said, taking the offered seat. I don't want to intrude on your conversation. Not at all, Sam assured her. We were just introducing Vince to Sheriff Daniels here. The third man, middle-aged with a neatly trimmed mustache and keen blue eyes, nodded to her. Robert Daniels, Miss Harlow, welcome to Pine Ridge. Thank you, Sheriff, Margaret replied, noting the badge pinned to his vest. His presence made her uneasy. What if her father reported her missing? What if he came looking for her? The sheriff seemed to sense her discomfort. Martha mentioned you're new in town, looking for a fresh start. You'll find Pine Ridge welcomes those who come with honest intentions. Vincent leaned forward slightly. Sheriff Daniels was just telling us about some trouble they've had with cattle rustlers in the area. Nothing for you to worry about, Miss Harlow, the sheriff said quickly. Just warning Vince here to keep an eye out when he's working at the Circle D. The conversation moved on to local matters, the upcoming town council meeting, plans for expanding the schoolhouse, news of a railroad spur that might eventually connect Pine Ridge to the main line. Margaret listened attentively, gradually relaxing as she realized that no one was questioning her past or her sudden appearance in town. When Sam and the sheriff excused themselves to join other townspeople, Vincent and Margaret were left alone at the table. The dining room had begun to empty as people finished their meals and moved to the hotel's small parlor or out to the saloon across the street. How are you settling in? Vincent asked, his voice low and concerned. Well, I think, Margaret replied. Martha has been kind and the work seems straightforward enough. She's a good woman, fair but firm. You'll learn a lot from her. Margaret nodded, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. When do you leave for the ranch? First light tomorrow, Vincent said, regret evident in his tone. I'm expected by midday. I see. Margaret looked down at her hands, trying to hide her disappointment. How long will you be there? A few weeks at least. They've got some young horses that need breaking and fence lines that need mending after the winter. He hesitated, then added, but as I said, I come into town regularly for supplies. Margaret raised her eyes to his. I would like to see you again when you do. The simple honesty of her statement seemed to catch Vincent off guard. His expression softened and something like hope flickered in his eyes. I'd like that too. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Vincent reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. I want you to have this, he said, placing it on the table between them. It was a small folding knife with a handle made of polished wood. It's not much, Vincent continued, but out here a good knife is valuable. For protection, if needed, but mostly as a tool. Margaret picked up the knife, feeling its weight in her palm. The gesture touched her deeply. It was both practical and personal. Thank you, I'll keep it with me always. Just in case, he said quietly. Though I pray you never need it for anything more serious than opening a letter. The clock on the dining room wall chimed 9, and Martha appeared in the doorway, giving them a meaningful look. Getting late, folks. Miss Harlow has an early start tomorrow. Vincent stood immediately. Of course. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Evans. Martha softened slightly. You're always welcome here, Mr. Keller. I've heard good things about your work from Sam. As they walked toward the staircase, Vincent kept a respectful distance from Margaret, mindful of appearances in her new workplace. At the bottom of the stairs, they paused. I should say good night, Margaret said reluctantly, and goodbye for now. For now, Vincent agreed. Margaret, he stopped, seemingly struggling with what to say. Take care of yourself. This is your chance for the life you want. Because of you, she said softly. I won't forget that. Impulsively, Margaret extended her hand. Vincent took it gently in his larger one, and instead of shaking it, he turned it over and pressed a light kiss to her palm, a gesture so unexpected and tender that Margaret felt her breath catch. Good night, Margaret Harlow, he said, releasing her hand slowly. Good night, Vincent Keller, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Margaret could feel his eyes following her. Only when she reached the landing did she allow herself to look back. Vincent still stood at the foot of the stairs, his expression a mixture of longing and restraint that mirrored her own conflicted feelings. With a final smile, Margaret turned and walked to her room, the weight of the small knife in her pocket a tangible reminder of the man who had changed her life. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to Margaret's life. She rose early each morning to help prepare the dining room for breakfast, spent her days changing linens, cleaning rooms, and assisting guests with their needs. The work was physically demanding but satisfying. For the first time, she was earning her own way, making her own decisions, answering to no one but herself and the reasonable expectations of her employer. Martha proved to be a fair boss and, increasingly, a friend. She asked no questions about Margaret's past, but provided guidance and support as Margaret adjusted to her new life. Betty, the kitchen girl, was a few years younger than Margaret and welcomed her companionship eagerly. The three women formed a small family of sorts, sharing meals and conversation when the work was done. Pine Ridge itself embraced Margaret with the same casual acceptance. She gradually became acquainted with the townspeople Mr. and Mrs. Bradley at the general store, Dr. Thompson and his wife, who sometimes dined at the hotel, Reverend Collins, who invited her to Sunday services, and many others who simply treated her as one of their own without prying into her history. But despite her growing contentment with her new life, Margaret found herself watching the street from the hotel windows, looking for a familiar figure on horseback. Vincent had not returned to town, and though she understood his work kept him at the Circle D, his absence left an unexpected emptiness. It was nearly 3 weeks after her arrival in Pine Ridge when Sam Wilson stopped by the hotel during the quiet afternoon hours. Margaret was arranging fresh flowers in the lobby when he entered, removing his hat as he stepped through the door. "Afternoon, Miss Harlow," he greeted her. "Place looks nice. Martha's lucky to have you." "Thank you, Sam," Margaret replied with a smile. "Can I help you with something?" "Actually, I thought you might like to know that Vince rode in about an hour ago. He's at the livery now, seeing to some business." Margaret tried to maintain a composed expression, but the sudden leap of her heart must have shown on her face because Sam grinned knowingly. "Thought that might interest you," he said. "He mentioned he might stop by the hotel later, but I figured I'd give you a heads up." "That's kind of you," Margaret managed, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. Sam replaced his hat with a wink. "He's a good man, Vince is, one of the best I know." After Sam left, Margaret found herself making small adjustments to her appearance whenever she had a moment, smoothing her hair, straightening her apron, pinching color into her cheeks. The anticipation of seeing Vincent again had her both excited and nervous in a way she'd never experienced. The afternoon stretched on with no sign of him. Margaret continued her duties, trying not to watch the door too obviously. By early evening, she had resigned herself to the possibility that he had changed his mind or been delayed. She was setting tables for dinner when the door finally opened and Vincent stepped into the hotel lobby. He wore clean clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing, and he carried a small package under one arm. When he saw her, a smile spread across his face that made her forget all the formalities she'd planned to observe. "Vincent," she said, abandoning her task and crossing to him. "You came." "I said I would," he replied simply. His eyes moved over her face as if memorizing her features. "You look well, Margaret. Pine Ridge agrees with you." "It does," she admitted. "I've found a place here, I think." Martha emerged from the kitchen, hands on her hips but a smile playing at her lips. "Mr. Keller, you're distracting my best employee." Vincent touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "My apologies, Mrs. Evans. I was hoping Miss Harlow might be free after her duties are complete." Martha glanced between them, noting the way they looked at each other. "Well, as it happens, we're not too busy tonight. Betty and I can manage if Margaret wants to take her supper break a bit early." Margaret turned to her employer with grateful surprise. "Are you sure, Martha?" "Go on," Martha said with a dismissive wave. "But be back by 8 to help with the evening turn-down." Vincent offered Margaret his arm. "May I escort you to dinner, Miss Harlow? There's a small cafe down the street that serves an excellent stew." Margaret slipped her arm through his, suddenly aware of how right it felt to be near him again. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Keller." The cafe was indeed small but charming, with checkered tablecloths and lanterns casting a warm glow over the half-dozen tables. They were seated in a quiet corner, somewhat removed from the other patrons. "I've been looking forward to this," Vincent admitted once they had placed their orders. "To seeing you again." "As have I," Margaret replied honestly. "How is your work at the Circle D?" Vincent told her about the ranch, the horses he was training, the challenges of mending fence lines damaged by winter storms, the characters among the ranch hands. He spoke with such passion about his work that Margaret found herself captivated by his enthusiasm. "But enough about horses and cattle," he said eventually. "Tell me about your life here. Are you truly happy, Margaret?" The sincerity in his question touched her deeply. "I am." "For the first time in years, perhaps," she smiled softly. "I have my own room, my own money, my own choices. It's liberating." "You deserve that freedom," Vincent said warmly. "Have you made friends? Martha and Betty have been wonderful. And the townspeople have accepted me without many questions." She paused, then added more quietly, "But I've missed our conversations. You're different from anyone I've ever known." Vincent's expression grew serious. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you." He reached for the package he had brought and placed it on the table between them. "This arrived at the ranch yesterday." Margaret unwrapped the brown paper to find a newspaper from Helena, the territorial capital. Vincent pointed to a small article on the third page. "Wealthy businessman seeks missing daughter Harold Harlow of St. Louis offers substantial reward for information leading to the safe return of his daughter, Margaret Harlow, 20, who disappeared while traveling by train through Montana Territory 3 weeks ago. Miss Harlow is described as 5'5" with chestnut hair and green eyes. Mr. Harlow fears she may have been abducted or suffered an accident." Margaret's hands trembled as she set the paper down. "He's looking for me." "Yes," Vincent confirmed grimly, "and offering money, which means people will be watching for you." "What should I do?" The fear that had begun to recede in recent weeks came rushing back. "I can't go back to him, Vincent. I won't." "And you won't have to," he assured her firmly. "But we need to be careful. Your father has resources and he might send people to search for you." "How did you get this?" Margaret asked, gesturing to the newspaper. "The ranch owner subscribes to papers from several cities. He showed it to me because." Vincent hesitated, then continued, "Because I had mentioned you to him. Not everything, just that I'd helped a young woman who needed assistance." The thought that Vincent had spoken about her, remembered her while they were apart, warmed Margaret despite her fear. "What do you suggest we do?" "For now, continue as you have been. Pine Ridge is small enough that strangers are noticed. If anyone comes asking questions, we'll know." He covered her hand with his own. "I've spoken to Sam and Sheriff Daniels, just told them you're running from a bad situation and need discretion. They'll help watch out for you." "You've thought of everything," Margaret said, grateful for his foresight. "I've been worried about you," Vincent admitted. "Even before I saw the newspaper, I know what it's like to be alone in the world, and I didn't want that for you." The simple honesty of his statement moved Margaret deeply. "I'm not alone," she said softly, "not anymore." Their eyes held for a long moment, the connection between them growing stronger with every shared confidence. Finally, Vincent cleared his throat and gently withdrew his hand. "There's something else," he said. "I've taken a more permanent position at the Circle D. Foreman's assistant, with the promise of advancement when old Johnson retires next year." "That's wonderful," Margaret said sincerely. "You deserve recognition for your skills." "It means I'll be staying in the area," Vincent continued, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "I'll be coming into town more regularly. Perhaps we could see more of each other." The question hung between them, tentative, hopeful, filled with possibility. Margaret felt a surge of happiness at the prospect of having Vincent in her life on a more regular basis. "I would like that very much," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. Relief and pleasure transformed Vincent's features. "Good, that's good." Their meal arrived, interrupting the moment but not diminishing the warmth that had blossomed between them. As they ate, their conversation turned to lighter topics: books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they had harbored since childhood. By the time they finished dinner and began walking back to the hotel, the early summer evening had painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Vincent walked close beside Margaret, not quite touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "I've been thinking," he said as they approached the hotel, "about your situation with your father." Margaret tensed slightly. "Yes," the newspaper article mentioned St. Louis. "That's a long way from Montana territory, and it described you as missing rather than specifying that you ran away. That gives us some advantage." "How so?" Margaret asked. "Your father might be looking for someone who appears lost or in distress. Not someone who's established herself in a community with employment and connections." Vincent stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "The best protection might be to strengthen your ties here, become so much a part of Pine Ridge that no one would question your presence." Margaret considered his words. "That makes sense. I've already begun to feel at home here." "Good." Vincent hesitated, then continued more quietly, "And I hope that, in time, you might consider me part of that home as well." The implication of his words, that he saw a future where they might be more than friends, sent a warm rush through Margaret's body. "I already do," she admitted. They had reached the hotel porch, and Vincent took her hand gently in his. "I have to return to the ranch tonight, but I'll be back in town next weekend. May I call on you then, properly?" Margaret smiled, her heart full. "Yes, Vincent, I would like that very much." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Until then, Margaret Harlow." "Until then, Vincent Keller." As Margaret watched him walk away, she realized that for the first time since her mother's death, she was looking forward to the future with genuine hope and joy. The next 2 months passed in a pattern that brought increasing happiness to Margaret's life. Vincent visited Pine Ridge every weekend, sometimes staying overnight at the hotel, other times riding in just for the day. They established a routine of sorts: walks through town, shared meals, occasional attendance at community gatherings like church socials or the Independence Day celebration. With each visit, their connection deepened. Vincent began bringing small gifts, wildflowers he'd picked along the way, a book he thought she might enjoy, once even a length of pretty blue ribbon for her hair that matched her eyes. Margaret treasured these tokens, not for their material value but for the thoughtfulness behind them. She thrived in her work at the hotel, earning Martha's complete trust and taking on additional responsibilities. Her days were full and purposeful, her future increasingly secure. The bruises from her past life had faded completely, leaving no visible reminders of what she had escaped. Only the shadow of her father's search clouded her happiness. The newspaper notice had been repeated in several territorial papers, and though no strangers had come to Pine Ridge specifically looking for her, Margaret remained cautious. She avoided having her photograph taken when a traveling photographer visited town, and she was careful about sharing details of her background with new acquaintances. One warm August evening, Vincent arrived unexpectedly at the hotel on a Wednesday. Margaret was helping serve dinner when she looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unusually serious. Her heart immediately constricted with worry. "Vincent," she said, setting down the coffee pot she'd been carrying, "is everything all right? Could we speak privately?" He asked, his voice low. Martha, noting the urgency in his manner, quickly intervened. "Go on, Margaret. Betty and I can manage here." Vincent led Margaret to a quiet corner of the hotel's small garden, where wrought iron benches offered privacy among flowering shrubs. The summer twilight was soft around them, but Margaret barely noticed the beauty as anxiety knotted her stomach. "What's happened?" she asked as soon as they were seated. Vincent took her hands in his. "2 men arrived at the Circle D today, asking questions. They showed a photograph of you and offered money for information." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Did anyone recognize me from the photograph?" "No, it was taken some years ago, I think. Your hair was styled differently and you looked younger, more sheltered." Vincent squeezed her hands gently. "I told them I'd never seen you and the ranch owner backed me up. They left, heading north." "But they could come back," Margaret whispered, "or others could come." "Yes," Vincent's expression was grave but determined. Margaret, I think we need to consider more permanent measures to secure your safety and your future. What do you mean? Vincent took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. I mean that I care for you deeply, more than I thought possible. These past months, getting to know you, seeing your strength and kindness, I find myself thinking of you constantly. Margaret's heart began to race, but for an entirely different reason than before. Vincent, please let me finish, he said gently. I know this may seem sudden, though it doesn't feel that way to me. I've known since the moment I caught you when you fell from that train that you were someone special. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small, simple ring with a modest pearl set in silver. Margaret Harlow, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes as emotions overwhelmed her surprise, joy, and a love that had been growing steadily since that night by the train tracks. Vincent, are you certain? More certain than I've ever been about anything, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. I love you, Margaret, and I want to build a life with you, one where you're safe, respected, and cherished as you deserve to be. But your work, your freedom, mean nothing without someone to share them with, he finished for her. I've been alone most of my life, believing that was my path. Then you literally fell into my arms and everything changed. Margaret looked at the simple ring, then at the face of the man who had rescued her in more ways than one. In Vincent, she had found not just safety but understanding, not just kindness but deep respect. He had never tried to control her or diminish her independence. Instead, he had supported her journey toward freedom and self-sufficiency. Yes, she said, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. Yes, Vincent, I will marry you. His face lit with such joy that Margaret felt her heart might burst. Gently, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then raised her hand to his lips. I promise to honor and protect you always, he said solemnly, not as your owner or master, but as your partner and friend. And I promise to stand beside you, Margaret replied, with honesty, faithfulness, and love. Vincent cupped her face tenderly and leaned forward. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise exchanged in the soft twilight of the garden. When they parted, Margaret felt as though her life had finally found its true beginning. There's one more thing, Vincent said, keeping her hand in his. I've been saving for years, putting aside most of my earnings. Last month, I purchased land, a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town. It's not much yet, a cabin, some corrals, good water, but it could be a home, our home. Margaret was speechless at this revelation. You bought land for us. For the future I hoped we might have together, Vincent confirmed. I'll continue working at the Circle D until our place is established, but eventually I want to raise our own horses, build something that's ours. When can I see it? Margaret asked eagerly. Vincent smiled at her enthusiasm. How about Sunday? We could ride out after church, have a picnic there. I'd like that very much. A thought occurred to her, bringing a slight frown to her face. Vincent, what about my father? If we marry, would that truly protect me? In the eyes of the law, yes, Vincent said firmly. As a married woman, you would no longer be under your father's authority, and a name change would provide additional protection. But more than that, we would be building a life where you're surrounded by people who know and care for you, who would stand with us if trouble ever came. The practical wisdom of his plan reassured Margaret. Marriage to Vincent would not be an escape or a compromise, but a positive choice, a step toward the life she wanted, with a man she had come to love deeply. How soon can we marry? She asked, surprising herself with her eagerness. Vincent's smile widened. As soon as you wish. Reverend Collins could perform the ceremony any Sunday after services, or we could wait if you prefer a more elaborate arrangement. Margaret shook her head. I don't need elaborate, I just need you and this new life we'll build together. He drew her close, wrapping his arms around her in a warm embrace. Then let's speak to the Reverend this Sunday and set a date. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, planning their future with quiet excitement, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate leap from a train, fleeing violence and control, to this garden where she freely chose to bind her life to a man who valued her independence as much as her companionship. It was, she decided, the most beautiful form of freedom she could imagine. The wedding took place on a bright September Sunday, 2 weeks after Vincent's proposal. It was a simple ceremony in Pine Ridge's white wooden church, attended by the friends Margaret had made in her new home, Martha and Betty from the hotel, Sam Wilson and his family, Sheriff Daniels and his wife, Dr. Thompson, the Bradleys from the general store, and a handful of ranch hands from the Circle D who had come to town for the occasion. Margaret wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Bradley had helped her select from the latest catalog, and that Betty had altered to fit perfectly. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, adorned with white flowers from Martha's garden. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of late summer wildflowers that Vincent had gathered that morning. Vincent waited for her at the altar, more handsome than she had ever seen him in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. The look of wonder in his eyes when she walked down the aisle on Sam Wilson's arm, who had offered to give her away, was something Margaret knew she would treasure forever. Reverend Collins spoke of commitment, partnership, and the sacred bond of marriage. When the time came to exchange vows, Vincent's voice was steady and sure, his promises simple but profound. Margaret responded with equal certainty, her heart full as she pledged herself to this man who had changed her life so completely. When Vincent slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, and when Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Margaret felt a sense of rightness and completion that she had never experienced before. The kiss they shared was brief but tender, mindful of their audience but expressive of the deep emotion that bound them together. As they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Keller, Margaret saw nothing but genuine happiness in the faces that surrounded them. A small reception followed at the hotel, where Martha had prepared a special dinner for the wedding party. There was laughter, music from a fiddle played by one of the ranch hands, and many toasts to the happiness of the new couple. Margaret moved through it all in a state of joyful disbelief that this was now her life surrounded by friends, married to a man she loved deeply, free from the shadows of her past. As the celebration wound down, Vincent led his bride to the wagon he had borrowed for the occasion. Their few possessions were already loaded, ready to be taken to their new home. "Are you ready, Mrs. Keller?" he asked softly, helping her onto the seat. Her new name sent a thrill through Margaret. "Yes, Mr. Keller, I believe I am." The small ranch that was to be their home lay in a sheltered valley, with a creek running through the eastern edge of the property and hills rising gently to the west. As they approached in the golden light of late afternoon, Margaret could see that Vincent had been working hard to prepare for their arrival. The cabin, though small, had a new coat of whitewash, flower boxes had been added to the windows, and smoke rose invitingly from the chimney. "I rode out early this morning to light the stove," Vincent explained as he helped her down from the wagon, "so it would be warm for you." "It's perfect," Margaret breathed, taking in the peaceful setting. Vincent lifted her into his arms without warning, making her gasp in surprise. "Tradition says I should carry you over the threshold," he said with a smile, carrying her toward the cabin door. Inside was simple but cozy, a main room with a stone fireplace, wooden table and chairs, a rocking chair by the hearth, shelves holding books and essential supplies. Through a doorway, Margaret glimpsed the bedroom, where a large bed covered with a colorful quilt dominated the space. Vincent set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. "Welcome home, Margaret," she turned in his embrace to face him. "Our home." His eyes darkened as he gazed down at her, and Margaret felt a new kind of anticipation flutter in her stomach. They were alone now, truly alone, for the first time since they had met. "Margaret," Vincent said softly, his voice deeper than usual, "I want you to know that we can take time. There's no rush for anything." His consideration touched her deeply. "I trust you, Vincent, completely." He cupped her face in his hands. "I will never give you cause to regret that trust." Their kiss was different from the chaste one they had shared in the church, deeper, more intimate, filled with the promise of all that lay ahead for them. Margaret wound her arms around his neck, pressing closer, reveling in the freedom to express her feelings without restraint. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Margaret Keller." The sound of her new name on his lips filled her with joy. "And I love you, Vincent Keller." The days and weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery as Margaret and Vincent established their life together. They settled into a routine that balanced work and companionship, each learning the other's habits and preferences. Vincent continued his position at the Circle D while simultaneously developing their own property. He built corrals and a small stable, acquired a milk cow and chickens, and began planning for the horses he would eventually breed and train on their land. Margaret transformed the cabin into a true home, creating curtains from fabric purchased in town, planting a small kitchen garden, arranging their few possessions with an eye for comfort and beauty. She rode into Pine Ridge twice a week to help Martha at the hotel, not from financial necessity now, but because she enjoyed the work and valued maintaining her independence and connections in town. Their evenings were spent together by the fire, reading aloud to each other, discussing their days, making plans for their future. And their nights were a revelation to Margaret, a healing counterpoint to the violence of her past, as Vincent showed her that physical intimacy could be tender, respectful, and deeply fulfilling. As autumn painted the landscape in rich golds and reds, Margaret received a letter from Martha that altered the careful balance of their new life. It was delivered by Sam Wilson, who had been in town and offered to bring it out to the ranch on his way home. "Martha said it was important," Sam explained as he handed the envelope to Margaret. "Came in on yesterday's mail coach." Vincent, who had been mending a bridle at the table, looked up with concern as Margaret opened the letter with trembling fingers. "It's from Betty," Margaret said, scanning the neat handwriting. "Two men came to the hotel asking specifically for Margaret Harlow. They had a newer photograph this time and a letter signed by my father authorizing them to bring me back to St. Louis." Vincent was immediately on his feet. "What else does she say?" Martha told them she'd never heard of Margaret Harlow, only Margaret Keller, who was now married and living outside of town. Margaret continued reading. "The men were suspicious, but left after Sheriff Daniels confirmed that I had been married in the church with proper documentation. Betty says they mentioned checking other towns along the railway before returning east." Vincent placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They have no legal claim on you now, Margaret. You're a married woman, not a runaway daughter." "I know," she covered his hand with her own. "But it worries me that they're still searching, still so determined to find me. Your father is a proud man from what you've told me. He likely can't accept that his daughter would choose to leave rather than obey his wishes." Vincent pulled a chair close to hers and sat down, keeping her hand in his. "But you're safe here. We have friends, legal standing, a life we're building together." Margaret nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. "You're right, and I won't let fear of him dictate our lives." "That's my brave wife," Vincent said with a gentle smile. He hesitated, then added, "There's something else I've been meaning to discuss with you, something for our future." "What is it?" Margaret asked, setting aside the letter. "I've been saving to buy more horses, good breeding stock. The Circle D owner has offered me first choice of their spring foals, and there's a breeder in Helena with a stallion that would give us a strong bloodline." His eyes lit with enthusiasm as he spoke. "If we start next year, within 3 to 5 years, we could have our own thriving horse business." Margaret listened intently, appreciating both his ambition and his inclusion of her in these plans. "It sounds wonderful, Vincent. Do we have enough saved?" "Almost." He squeezed her hand. "A few more months at my current wages and we'll be ready to begin." "What if we had help?" Margaret suggested. "I've been saving too from my work at the hotel." Vincent looked surprised. "You'd want to invest in the horses?" "Of course," Margaret said firmly. "This is our ranch, our future. I want to be part of building it in every way." The pride and love in Vincent's eyes warmed Margaret to her core. "You never cease to amaze me," he said softly. "Most women would prefer their husbands to spend on household comforts or fine dresses." "I'm not most women," Margaret reminded him with a smile, "and we have everything we need already." Vincent leaned forward to kiss her, a gesture that still sent Margaret's heart racing after weeks of marriage. "Indeed we do," he murmured against her lips. That night, as they lay together in their bed, warm despite the autumn chill that had descended outside, Margaret felt a profound contentment settle over her. The path that had brought her here from a life of constraint and fear to one of love and partnership had been uncertain and fraught with danger. Yet somehow, she had found not just safety but happiness beyond anything she had dared to imagine. As if sensing her thoughts, Vincent drew her closer in his arms. "What are you thinking about, wife?" he asked, his voice a soft rumble in the darkness. "How fortunate I am," Margaret replied honestly. "How grateful that I found the courage to jump from that train." "And I'm grateful I was there to catch you," Vincent said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Though I think you would have found your way regardless. You're stronger than you know, Margaret," she smiled against his chest. "Perhaps, but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." "You never will," he promised. "Not ever again." Spring brought new life to the Keller ranch. The kitchen garden Margaret had planted flourished with vegetables and herbs. Chickens scratched contentedly in their yard, producing eggs in abundance, and wildflowers bloomed across the valley in a riot of colors. More significantly, the stable now housed 3 pregnant mares, the foundation of the horse breeding operation Vincent had envisioned. He had carefully selected each one for bloodlines and temperament, investing their combined savings in what he believed would be a prosperous future for them both. Margaret had embraced ranch life completely, learning to help with the animals, improving her riding skills, and maintaining their home while still keeping her connection to Pine Ridge through her twice-weekly work at the hotel. The balance she had struck between independence and partnership seemed to strengthen her marriage rather than strain it. On a warm May morning, as Margaret hung freshly washed linens on the line behind the cabin, she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Shading her eyes against the sun, she recognized Sam Wilson driving, with Martha beside him on the seat. "Visitors," she called to Vincent, who was working in the corral with one of the mares. They welcomed their friends warmly, ushering them into the cabin where Margaret quickly prepared coffee and served the apple cake she had baked the previous day. "This isn't just a social call," Martha admitted as they settled around the table, "though it's always a pleasure to see you both." "What brings you all the way out here, then?" Vincent asked, accepting the cup Margaret handed him. Sam and Martha exchanged glances before Martha continued. "There's been some news that we thought you should hear from friends rather than strangers." Margaret's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "What is it?" Word came on yesterday's mail coach, Sam said. "Harold Harlow died 3 weeks ago in St. Louis, heart failure, according to the newspaper article." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, the coffee pot clutched tightly in her hands until Vincent gently took it from her and set it on the table. "My father is dead." The words felt strange in her mouth, disconnected from any real emotion. "Yes, dear," Martha said gently. "The article was in the St. Louis paper that comes to the hotel. It mentioned that he is survived by a son, Thomas, and a daughter, Margaret, whereabouts unknown." Vincent placed a supportive hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Thank you for bringing this news in person. We thought it best," Sam agreed. "Especially given what else the article said." Margaret looked up sharply. "What else?" Martha reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded newspaper. "Perhaps you should read it yourself." With trembling hands, Margaret accepted the paper and found the article, a substantial one befitting a man of her father's wealth and standing. She read silently, aware of Vincent reading over her shoulder, his hand a steady presence on her back. The piece detailed her father's business accomplishments, his standing in St. Louis society, and then turned to more personal matters. Mr. Harlow was preceded in death by his wife, Eleanor, in 1881, a loss from which associates say he never fully recovered. His subsequent estrangement from his daughter, Margaret, was a source of deep regret in his final years, according to family friend James Whittaker. Harold spoke often of his desire to reconcile with his daughter, Whittaker stated. He recognized that his grief had led him to actions he later regretted deeply, particularly regarding the arranged marriage he had attempted to force upon her. The article went on to note that substantial funds had been allocated in Harold Harlow's will for the continued search for his daughter, not to compel her return, but to offer her rightful inheritance and his posthumous apology. Margaret set the paper down, emotions warring within her: confusion, anger, grief for what might have been, relief that the threat of forced return had finally ended. "I don't know what to feel," she admitted quietly. Vincent's arm slipped fully around her shoulders. "You don't have to know right now, or ever." Martha reached across the table to pat Margaret's hand. "We thought you should know everything, dear, so you could make informed choices." "Choices," Margaret echoed, "about whether to make your whereabouts known to your brother," Sam explained. "The article mentioned an inheritance which could be significant." Vincent shook his head firmly. "Money isn't worth the risk of reopening old wounds. Margaret has a life here now, a good life." "It's Margaret's decision," Martha reminded him gently. All eyes turned to Margaret, who sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what she had read. Her father's regret, coming too late to heal the breach between them. The inheritance, which could change their financial situation dramatically. The risk of revealing her location, even now. "I need time to think," she finally said, "but I'm grateful to you both for bringing this to me directly." After Martha and Sam departed, promising to keep the information confidential until Margaret decided how to proceed, Vincent found his wife sitting on the porch swing he had built for her, staring out at the distant hills. He sat beside her without speaking, offering his presence without demands or expectations. The silence between them was comfortable, built on months of growing trust and understanding. "He regretted what he did," Margaret eventually said, "but he never apologized directly. Never tried to find me to make amends, only to bring me back. People often recognize their mistakes too late," Vincent observed quietly. "Yes." Margaret turned to look at her husband, her expression thoughtful. "The inheritance could help us, Vincent. We could expand the ranch sooner, buy more horses, build a larger house eventually." "We don't need it," Vincent said firmly. "We're doing well as we are. The mares will foal next month, and by next year we'll start seeing returns on our investment." "I know. But it could make things easier, faster." She took his hand in hers. "And it's rightfully mine. My mother's family contributed to my father's initial business success. Some of that money should have come to me regardless." Vincent studied her face carefully. "You're considering claiming the inheritance." "I'm considering letting my brother know that I'm alive and well and married," Margaret clarified. "The inheritance would be a consequence of that, not the primary motivation. And if he tried to persuade you to return to St. Louis." Margaret's response was immediate and certain. "My home is here with you. Nothing could change that." The conviction in her voice seemed to reassure Vincent. He brought her hand to his lips in a gesture that had become a familiar expression of his affection. "Then I support whatever decision you make, Margaret. This is your family, your past. You have the right to address it on your terms." Margaret leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I'll write to Thomas. Not with our location at first, just to establish contact and assess his intentions. If I believe they're honorable, then perhaps we can consider a more direct connection." "A wise approach," Vincent agreed, cautious but not fearful. They sat together as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the valley in warm hues of gold and amber. The ranch stretched before them, modest but full of promise, the tangible embodiment of the future they were building together. "Whatever happens with my family's inheritance," Margaret said softly, "I already have everything that truly matters." Vincent's arm tightened around her shoulders. "As do I, my love, as do I." 1 year later, Margaret stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching as Vincent worked with a spirited 2-year-old colt in the training corral. The young horse was one of their own breeding, the first generation of what was becoming known in the territory as Keller stock, prized for intelligence and stamina. The ranch had grown considerably. A new, larger stable housed their expanding herd. Additional corrals provided space for training, and the cabin had been enlarged into a proper house with a dedicated kitchen, a comfortable parlor, and 2 additional bedrooms beyond their own. Some of these improvements had been made possible by Margaret's inheritance, which had indeed been substantial. After careful correspondence with her brother, who had expressed genuine relief at finding her alive and well, Margaret had agreed to meet him in Helena 6 months earlier. The reunion had been tentative but healing, with Thomas offering sincere apologies for his past actions and his failure to protect her from their father's violence. The legal matters had been settled without Margaret needing to return to St. Louis, and the funds had been transferred to a bank in Pine Ridge, where she and Vincent had joint control over their use. They had invested wisely in land, livestock, and improvements that would secure their future prosperity. But the greatest treasure of their life together had nothing to do with financial inheritance. Margaret's gaze shifted to the small figure sitting on a blanket in the shade of the porch, their daughter, Eleanor, named for Margaret's mother, who had just celebrated her 3rd month of life. The baby was a perfect blend of her parents' Vincent's dark hair and strong features softened by Margaret's green eyes and fair complexion. Her arrival had brought a new dimension to their happiness, deepening the bond between them as they embraced parenthood with the same partnership that characterized their marriage. Vincent completed his session with the colt and walked toward the house, his face lighting with a smile as he spotted his wife and daughter waiting for him. He bounded up the porch steps, pausing to kiss Margaret before bending to scoop up the baby, who gurgled with delight at the sight of her father. "How are my favorite girls today?" he asked, cradling Eleanor carefully against his chest. "Wonderful," Margaret replied, leaning into his side. "Just watching you work and enjoying the beautiful day." Vincent looked out over their property, satisfaction evident in his expression. "We've come a long way in a year." "In more ways than one," Margaret agreed, thinking of all that had changed since her desperate leap from a train had brought her into this man's arms. From that moment of blind faith and terror, she had found not just safety but purpose, not just escape but belonging, not just protection but true partnership. The bruises of her past had healed completely, leaving no scars on her heart or spirit. "Any regrets?" Vincent asked softly, the question an echo of conversations they had shared throughout their marriage. Margaret looked up at her husband, at the love and respect shining in his eyes, then at their daughter, the embodiment of their shared future. Around them, the ranch they had built together thrived in the summer sunshine. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "Every step of the journey brought me here, to you and Eleanor, to this life we've created together. How could I regret any of it?" Vincent's free arm wrapped around her waist, drawing her close as their daughter nestled contentedly between them. "I caught you when you fell," he murmured against her hair, "but you've been lifting me higher ever since." As the sun began its gentle descent toward the western horizon, painting the Montana sky in brilliant hues of pink and gold, Margaret Keller stood embraced by the family she had found and created, surrounded by the life she had chosen freely. The train that had carried her away from oppression was long gone, its tracks a distant memory. In its place ran a new path, one she walked by choice, with love as her compass and freedom as her destination, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never need to run again.